Okay, now we're broadcasting live. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Sada Altan, and I'm the director of Aura Istanbul. It is truly a great pleasure that I'm able to moderate today's Aura on Saturday conference hosting Professor Lesley Lokko'yu. For the ones who are here for the first time, I'd like to give a little background on the Aura Istanbul. The name of Aura stands for Architecture and Urbanism Research Academy. Aura Istanbul was established in 2017 as a nonprofit organization. Although we are organizing many public events, the main focus of the academy is to be a think tank for young architects and designers with its certificate program. And in 4 years' time, our program became a bridge of experimentation and research. Last but not least, I'd like to thank our sponsor of this special event, which is Pekdemir'e. It's a construction, architecture, and projects company. With no further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Sinan İzgi, architect and one of the founding members of Aura. So the floor is yours, Sinan.
Thank you, Sada. Dear guests, welcome to another episode of Aura Istanbul Saturday Conferences. Our guest today's presentation is Lesley Lokko'yu. Lesley Lokko'yu founded and led Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg and has taught at institutions including Iowa State University, University of Illinois, Kingston University, University of Westminster, and the University of North London. Her most recent role was Dean of Architecture at the Spitzer School of Architecture in New York. After resigning from her role in October last year, she now plans to start building the African Futures Institute, an independent postgraduate school of architecture in Accra, Ghana, this January. Lesley Lokko'yu was named last week the 11th winner of the Ernest Pink Award for Excellence in Architectural Education, which is awarded every 2 years by the Royal Institute of British Architects to a person who has made an outstanding contribution to architectural education. Dear Lesley, on behalf of Aura Istanbul, I would like to congratulate you for the well-deserved award. We are so pleased and honored to have your support as a friend of Aura Istanbul. Unfortunately, unlike last time, today, there's a physical space between us because of the circumstances. But I would like to extend our invitation for a third episode already in Istanbul in next year after the pandemic is over, if you accept. So thank you very much for being with us again, and I would like to give you the floor for your presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see and hear me properly. And it's absolutely wonderful to be back at Aura Istanbul. Although I can say that being with you on Zoom is a really poor substitute for being in Istanbul itself. And that has nothing to do with the amazing fish and raki that I had the last time I was at Aura. I know everybody says this, but it really is one of the world's most spectacular and special cities in all kinds of ways. And I really hope it won't be too long before I get the chance to visit again. A huge thank you to Sinan and Seda for this invitation to talk this afternoon. It's my first talk this year, and although we are only 9 days into the year, I cannot wait to see the end of this year either. And when Sinan first emailed me, I was here in Edinburgh trying to organize a flight to Accra at a time when flights were being cancelled every other day. I did manage to get to Accra, and I spent 6 weeks in an alternative universe where COVID certainly exists, but with nothing like the rates of infection and fatalities that we're seeing in the UK. So it's been quite strange, or a quite strange couple of months, going from one reality, which is the UK, to the next, which is Ghana. But on to today's talk, I'm beginning to be a little bit suspicious of the word lecture, which is entitled Burning Down the House. And for people of a certain age who are on this Zoom call, the phrase burning down the house may conjure up something quite specific. So I actually struggled. Yeah.
I'm so sorry for interrupting. We can see your Zoom floating controls on your presentation. So can you just click that 3 dots button that calls more, and then click hide floating controls.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. So we're all good now?
And cross the admitted thing on the, thank you.
All right.
I'm so sorry for interrupting.
No worries. So I actually struggled quite a bit with the title, which is usually the first place I go when I think about giving a talk. And I think it's partly because I'm a novelist, but the title really is the emotional and sometimes intellectual framework for what I want to say. If I'm able to land on a title fairly quickly, then the rest of the lecture, much like a narrative or a story, seems to follow relatively easily. A novelist, but the title really is the emotional and sometimes... I'm hearing a feedback loop. Is that gone?
Yeah.
Okay, great. As soon as Sinan asked me to give a talk, I thought of the line from the song, and I also thought of the first line, "Watch out, you might get what you're after." So 2020 was a really difficult year for everyone. It changed everything, I think, in ways that we're probably not even yet aware of. And I'd like to talk today about 2020, but its roots extend much farther back than 12 months or even 12 years. In so many ways, the seeds were sown centuries ago and will not end with a few corporate statements or an Instagram takeover. What was at stake and what remains at stake is change, an idea that was powerfully articulated by Obama, but is, in institutions as well as individuals, surprisingly difficult to enact. If people, especially grown-ups, are difficult to change, the same can and should be said about institutions. Most institutions are built to withstand change, not to embrace it, no matter what the mission statement says. So over the past week, even though the title of this talk came to me very quickly, I've been struggling with what to call it. A keynote, a manifesto, a reflection, a rant. By coincidence, although I'm not sure I believe in coincidences anymore, I happened to be reading the British journalist Caitlin Moran's hysterically funny but very sharp novel, How to Build a Girl. I won't go into the details of the novel, but it is a brilliant description of how we build ourselves out of the raw material that we've been given, which is not unlike the job of an architect, building something out of raw material. So what I'm going to talk today is about the process of building the kind of architect, as David Adjaye calls it, that I always wanted to see. Now, race, as we all know, operates very differently in different places and in different contexts. To speak in Ghana, for example, of a black architect is meaningless. Everyone, more or less, is black. To speak in South Africa of a minority architect would be similarly odd, since the vast majority of the population is African. The word native means one thing in the United States, but something very different in Kenya. It's all kind of arbitrary in its language, but it is anything but arbitrary in its experience and practice. What you call yourself and what you are called seems to depend largely on where you are, and this has a really important knock-on effect in terms of how you approach pedagogy and the issue or the idea of change. If I were asked to be as clear as possible about how I've approached it, both as a teacher and as a leader of institutions, I would say that the following 3 words are absolutely key: confidence, context, and content, and they are completely intertwined. You build confidence through addressing both content and context. With the right levels of confidence, you are able to change content, and through readings or new readings of context, you are able to shape new content. It might sound easy or at least smooth and simple. In practice, however, it is anything but. So I'm going to speak to these three issues as clearly and directly as I can for the rest of this talk. I'm going to show a mixture of projects and events which in different ways all tackle one or other or more of these three words that I've selected. For those of you who've heard me lecture before, you'll know that I often use film as a way of bringing context alive, particularly as I'm usually talking about places that many people in the audience are not familiar with. I'm going to do the same today, but I've chosen slightly different kinds of videos, usually quite short, although there is a longer one of about 11 minutes, which I think is worth watching. The material is often dense and sometimes quite intense, so I've chosen three examples: how to build a Black architect, how to build an African female architect, and how to build a decolonized architect. And this is by no means an exhaustive account. These are just three examples out of many, but I hope you'll get a sense of the approach. So here's the first one.
Black is fear, everything negative or perceived to be negative, and it also happens to be the color of my skin.
Black is a color that is not on our rainbow flag in our nation. I think that we still have a lot of work in progress to do to actually create what a rainbow nation is.
It's such a hard one because you're not aware of being Black. You're only aware when someone else makes you aware that your skin color is a problem.
We know that things happen in the world that shaped our perceptions of what we think of the word Black.
You're really not sure how people are going to respond to you when you walk into a room, so you always have to come in with a defense mechanism.
Black is the opposite of me, my fellow South Africans.
There's a stamp on who I am. Yeah.
Black is not necessarily a skin color. I think it's an identity.
My identity.
It doesn't define who they are, it doesn't define where that person comes from.
Black is also what I feel is advantage in our current society.
Yeah, oh, Black.
I think that there's a new sense of power in Blackness and what it means to be Black.
Black is beautiful.
I'm Black. I love my skin tone. I love my hue. Black is beautiful.
Sorry. Safe space fits in under what I'd call transformative pedagogy. Sorry, I keep having to block out people coming into the waiting room, so it's playing a bit of havoc. I'll stop doing it. Safe space fits in under what I'd call transformative pedagogy. Because we live, particularly here, in a society where these larger kind of questions around race, around identity, around class, around gender, around power, are so intrinsic to the way people think. So in a way, safe space was conceived of as a kind of unlocking in a very controlled way of a lot of these issues, not just in problematic ways, but actually in creative ways. We began to think about the idea of providing a kind of space over an extended period of time with the same group of people where you would all feel comfortable and safe, in inverted commas, enough to say what might not necessarily be said in the open or in public. And you know, architecture is so deeply connected to issues of identity, power, space, etc. It just seems the most logical discipline to begin to ask those questions.
I feel like I need a voice.
Finally get over my fear of voicing my opinion.
I realize how brainwashed I am and how my set of norms are not necessarily correct, and I wanted to change that.
I feel like I don't belong.
So today's exercise is going to be about what we call othering. So your other is the person who you see yourself as not.
Where we had to stare at each other. It became quite difficult after like the first minute, because all of a sudden you're staring at this individual, but you sort of have to stare at them and still stay composed enough while dealing with the thoughts that come into your mind.
You said you were from Zimbabwe, and also that you're a Christian.
The first year I saw this oldish lady.
I don't exist. I'm maybe old South Africa to her.
Sometimes I wish I was him.
I've been born into my privilege. I acknowledge that there's a lot of wrongs being done, but that was before my time.
Will white privilege end? What is white privilege? Is it a thing of the past? What about black pain? What about black trauma? What about all of these things that we're talking about? And I mean, I'm kind of interested to know, well, how do we move forward? Today's exercise, it's called the Privilege Walk. Can you arrange yourselves of your own accord along a line according to your estimation of your own privilege? If you've ever felt unwelcome in areas with a predominant user group that is not your own, step backward. And if you feel like your culture is constantly overwritten by other cultures, and made to seem less important in comparison, step backward.
People don't really take Tswana speaking people quite serious.
Just being Afrikaans, it feels very threatening.
How can we leave the room for Afrikaans culture in an environment that hurts a lot of the other cultures so much?
I don't think I've got an answer for that, I think.
Are you prepared to experience loss? Do you think it's something that's fair?
Language is also a weapon, like many other tools of power.
When I went back home in Namibia, I felt so powerful. I walked back with a confidence I never really had at home. And I think that's because being here, I've been so on edge and armored all the time and really afraid.
I just feel like there's so much hostility in this country. And it's not just a thing of hostile to white people, it's hostile to difference.
Exercise was really revealing. Privilege can mean so many different things.
We're all actually just humans at the end of the day. It's very complex.
I think to have the opportunity or the time to sit back and think about what privilege is a privilege.
Today we are going to be doing something called the numbers game. And what we're going to ask you to do is to provide an alternative reading of all the personality types that you find in the graph, but in terms of race or culture. This is a way to find out, what do you really think of the other?
Well, I just wanted to add that the basic desire of the African is to feel valued, and that the holy idea of the African is hope and freedom.
Who's hopeful? So it's not an exclusively Black African. What if we thought about this completely differently? What if you understood radical to be something totally different, and you said that the radical is actually not changing the way you think about everything, but everything about the way you think. You know, it's that old phrase, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And so here we are in the same old tools of corruption, hypocrisy, black, white. But you know what, y'all, these tools have been around for a long time. And we're not tired of them.
I think today's session was kind of hard.
It still felt like everybody's kind of tiptoeing around the sensitive subjects.
It's a very tricky thing to deal with.
Perhaps safe space isn't so safe.
As a first step to having those conversations, I think it's a starting point.
Session 5 is called strategic silencing, and this is just the way that we use language. And there's this really beautiful list that has been made just to try and unpack the way that we strategically try to get an upper hand on conversation.
Well, I think I'm guilty of most. I must say, I think I use every single one almost.
I'm just such a verbose person. I just have no filter sometimes. And I would say something, I'll come back and say, hey, I'm just joking. After I see that it touched the nerve that I didn't expect.
If black people hate white people, let's deal with it. It's okay. You can hate us, but let's not pretend.
Always doesn't come from a point of hatred. It always comes from a point of, but guys, actually, if we're talking about this radical idea, if we're taking this thing to the far end, is this what it is? There's a space where it's actually quite safe, because I think if we had to take this conversation out to the street, this can turn into something it is not supposed to be.
It's an interesting space, the safe space. It's very, very interesting. It is very important to not tell the person to stop or you are overreacting, than to allow the person to just talk and then learn from that and begin to question, what can I do as a white person about this situation? Because it's always black people talking about racism in schools and this. What are white people talking about racism in schools? What are they talking about? What are they doing about it?
And I think for me as a black woman, you're always, I wouldn't say oppressed, but you're limited in the way in which you express yourself. I find myself limiting how much I can say or what I can say, but I think being in safe space, you can now go, and especially if you've got sisters or cousins, you can start introducing these topics. This was one of the first times I felt like I can actually just let it out and just allow it to be.
As my blinkers get wider and I can never see the whole picture, and it's just my learning and speaking and having experiences like Safe Space that you get to hear and understand other people's perspectives.
Because this is really giving us a voice, it's really letting us know that you should be able to talk about these things, you should be able to express how you feel.
Kind of things that we want you to do today are less to do with the problematics of race and identity, which are a lot of the things that we've been talking about, but to move into that space which was the freedom of creative expression. What we're asking for you all to find is the place of beauty in the undecided, indecidable.
I'm too black for white people and too white for black people, right? So for me, it's like I'm always that person in the middle.
And we come back to these same systems of classification. Who is one thing? Who is another? Who is pure?
The walls that were there before are what defined your understanding of what kind of guided you in this world that you know. It was what was familiar, but now I'm entering into territories of the shadow, the territories of the unknown, and me trying to figure out who I am now in this context.
It's hard to describe how privileged you are. I go to schools overseas and I see students faffing around just looking for something to work with. And here you have the opposite challenge, in that the world is roaring at you, it's full. And I think this is what we're trying to say to all of you in this brave new world of your profession. It is up to you to decide how you want to use those tools.
I'm beginning to interrogate and investigate what are these tools. Could they be more than what I think they are? Can I use them differently? And I think that is something that Safe Space has kind of really sparked in me.
All these tools and all this information, we can recreate a better world.
We are actually changing. So I think our last conversation actually gave me light. It's quite an interesting space that I'm in.
It's so refreshing, it's so new, it's so bold.
I'm breaking out of the shell. I'm now showing my true colors. So I think Safe Space for me has brought that confident aspect into my work.
Safe Space has allowed me to look at things in a more critical way.
I sit here comfortable to be in my own skin, proud of where I am and excited what lies ahead. This is who I have become.
Can I influence this nation? Can I influence this continent? Can I influence this world? So yeah, I'm trying to investigate what are these tools, what do I have in my hands?
This is me. Yes.
Hand on my heart, South African students are amongst the most talented students I've ever taught in 30 years. And I think part of that reason has to do with the fact that they live in states of tension, even subliminal tension, and tension is good for creativity. So if we can discipline that tension and turn it into a productive tool, we will be astounded at what's going to come out of them. So Safe Space was filmed over 12 weeks, 6 episodes, once every 2 weeks, which allowed us some time to process the material, but also to gauge how far we could push each other. The idea grew out of conversations with 2 part-time tutors at the GSA, John O'Bennett and Talisa Cindy, who were interested in running a course on race and identity. I thought it should be a documentary, however, and set about raising the funding to do it. We brought a psychologist and a facilitator on board, partly to deal with any ethical issues, but also because I'm not a trained psychologist and I wasn't sure I would be able to handle any of the fallout when it occurred. At the end of the day, if there's one thing I have learned, it is not to be afraid of one's own shortcomings, especially not when the alternative, which would be to do or say nothing, is far worse. The psychologist left after the first session, and we more or less managed to finish the documentary in one piece. It was a complex project, and not everyone who participated came away happy, but I would do it again, slightly differently perhaps, in a heartbeat. For the students who participated, I can confidently say that it changed their work in significant ways. And that, for me, in spite of the arguments and the tears and the accusations and all of the emotional baggage that came tumbling out, was the real prize, seeing the sudden upsurge in confidence, clarity, and complexity in their work. There are many ways to be African, just as there are many ways to be a woman. These 2 women, one a 49-year-old Jewish South African, and the other a 32-year-old Black South African, both deal with gender, patriarchy, and power in very different ways. And the work that you'll see in these next 2 very short videos was directed by 2 of the most talented tutors I've ever come across. Samaya Valley, who joined the GSA on a wing and a prayer long before I had the funds to pay or appoint her properly, and Stephen Stain, a young, supremely gifted thinker and writer who supervised Mandy Schindler's work, which you'll see in the second video. So again, these are 2 very short videos.
Across from me at the kitchen table, my mother smiles over tea that she drinks out of a measuring glass. She says she doesn't deprive herself, but I've learned to find nuance in every movement of her fork, in every crinkle of her brow, as she offers me the uneaten pieces on her plate. I've realized that she only eats dinner when I suggest it. I wonder what she does when I'm not there to do so. Maybe this is why my house feels bigger each time I return. It's proportional. As she shrinks, the space around her seems increasingly vast. She wanes while my father waxes. His stomach has grown round with late nights, oysters, and privilege. It was the same with his parents. As my grandmother became frail and angular, her husband swelled to red round cheeks and a round stomach. And I wonder if my lineage is one of women shrinking, making space for the entrance of men into their lives, not knowing how to fill it back up once they leave. I've been taught accommodation. My brother never thinks before he speaks. I've been taught to filter. How can anyone have a relationship to food, he asks, laughing, as I eat the black bean soup I chose for its lack of carbs. I want to say, we come from difference. You have been taught to grow out. I have been taught to grow in. You learn from our father how to emit, how to produce, to roll each thought off your tongue with confidence. You used to lose your voice every other week from shouting so much. I learned to absorb. I took lessons from our mother in creating space around myself. I learned to read the knots in her forehead, and I never meant to replicate her, but spend enough time sitting across from someone and you pick up their habits. That's why women in my family have been shrinking for decades. We all learned from each other, the way each generation taught the next how to knit, weaving silence in between the threads, deciding how many bites is too many, how much space she deserves to occupy. Watching the struggle, I either mimic or hate her, and I don't want to do either anymore. But the burden of this house has followed me across the country. I asked 5 questions today, and all of them started with the word sorry. Inheritance is accidental.
This is a site plan, and my theme is a birthing center, and it's a labor of love in the 21st century. And I've used many different materials. This is linen, and on it I created a grid. So I try and give the sewing a very architectural, structured form, but yet it's still got the natural fall of the linen. Sewing is not perfect. It's very hard to get exact lines, especially when I'm doing free motion sewing. I've used a combination of tea bags for the color, for the texture. I've grounded it in with the sewing machine. I've used tracing paper. This is silk which I burnt with incense because it's a controlled flame, and it gives that sense of movement which is representing the network. And here are burnt pieces of paper that are then sewed on, which are just architecturally representing the trees. So these are the boundaries that the site that I'm choosing is going to have between its surroundings. So this is an existing building. This is the proposed site. This is a park going down here, and these are the connections, either the visible connections, the unseen connections. So it's just showing that the site is connected to what is around it. The method of making which I'm using has been despised of women. There is a systematic dismissal of the level of artisanship which are beyond artisanal, and it shapes a specific aesthetic and a vision. When I make, I sit down at my machine, and there is a direct link between my body and the creativity through my handling of the surface of the fiber architecture about to unfold. It's a space where things take shape, slip through, and where meaning is produced. It is a subtle weaving of form and content. These are the idioms that have been despised of women. And on that note, I want to reiterate, women sew, they do. This is a new technique for me. I've never used sewing before, and I'm using it to express architecture. And I'm learning how it actually connects to safe space, because it's a very unsafe space, a very uncomfortable space to bring sewing and feminism to architecture, which is a very masculine trade. And this also brings me to my Western theme. You know, the Western, that women should be like X, or women should be this powerful woman in business. Anything feminine degrades us. And being in Africa and doing safe space, I question the West, I question my givens. I'm learning all the time, and maybe it's good to go back to these kind of crafts. The GSA is so dynamic and so diverse and so creative, and it just allows us to express ourselves, and not necessarily in the traditional way that architectural schools do allow it. Use ceramics, use carving, use sculpture. Go for it. Maybe inside everybody there's some craft or some handwork or some ancient technique that could be brought to the forefront to be expressed in architecture, because architecture is changing.
So there are two things I'd like to touch on in relation to their work, the work of Mandy and of Gugu: time and value. It's an open secret that I despise the word semester, and the reason is simple. Nowhere have I managed to find a good enough reason for dividing up the academic year into semesters, roughly 13 weeks, or terms, roughly 8 weeks. Cathy Davidson's book, The New Education, was a revelation to me, and I'm going to suggest that everyone read it rather than try and summarize it. But it's enough to say that so many of the structures that appear as if they were sent down the mountain with Moses were not. Academia, like any other institution, is a construct. Timetables are not God-given, they are man-made. My experience of trying to change the timetable at Spitzer was like trying to change the Constitution. Impossible, in other words. If the timetable says 2 hours on a Tuesday, that is how it will remain. But 13 weeks is not enough time. In my opinion, and it is only my opinion, it is not enough time to develop a project to any level of sophistication at the best of times. But when you are trying to unpack centuries worth of canon in order to find your own voice, it is impossible. In the past year in the US, I have seen students trying to design a city, not a building or even a neighborhood, but an entire city in one semester. If that is not the height of hubris, I don't know what is. But it is precisely this framing of content as normative, as universal, that is so problematic. But at the GSA, rather than decree that there is no such thing as the universal, we decided rather to create a diverse environment with diverse voices in which we could critique work openly with different and divergent understandings from different frameworks. We had to find the money, but we instituted a number of different review frameworks, the International Critics Week, which was an annual gathering of 24 global critics whose work it was to review the work of the school as a whole. We put on symposia like Forgetting Architecture, where we piggybacked student reviews onto the symposium so that the students would get the full benefit of outside voices from other disciplines, and other ways to think about architecture that were not conventional or traditional, but might open up different possibilities for expression and representation that were outside the existing canon.
And this is what we found, an inventory of feminist upheaval.
Was anarchy merely an expression of love and care?
The methods of struggle are improvised in the cell, improvised in the air, improvised from nothing.
The reformers and the journalists didn't know.
They didn't know that the hallway and stairwell were places of assembly, or that you love in doorways.
Feminists are activists.
The riot is like a general strike, a bridge between now and the free territory.
The riot seeks to preserve nothing.
规制首下两制，第二次是有权谋。
The enclosure provides the field for heroic deeds.
Mosadi o tshwara thipa ka bohale.
Lempi imayelana namantombazana amancane azoba nenkinga efana neyami.
They dream a new set of arrangements. They dream the end of involuntary servitude.
What did she think of herself? Not much, or quite a lot, depending how you looked at it.
We are not what other people say we are. We are who we know ourselves to be. We are what we love. That's okay.
What we stand on is not masonry.
It is the torn place, unhealed.
Yila izilonda zingapholi khona. Yila izilonda zingapholi khona.
This is a second short video. Oops, sorry. No, sorry. So we also had to find new ways to value work. If performance was going to be one of the ways in which African students would find their own voices, we had to find ways to make sure that that performance could properly be evaluated. We brought on board 2 classically trained actresses who were able to both prepare and evaluate student performances. But to do this, to put on a new, non-credit bearing course in that context was easy. We found the money, we found the 2 actresses, we put up the adverts, and we invited the students to participate, if they wanted. They didn't have to, but they all did. I didn't have to go through a curriculum committee. I did not have to canvass colleagues for support. I did not have to liaise with central finance or computing or IT in order to put it onto the system or to ensure transfer credits or all of the administrative bureaucracy that in the end will kill the kind of innovation we seek. I want to say this as simply and clearly as possible. If the agenda of the school, whatever school it is transformational, if transformation is what the school aims to engage with, then it must be transformational in every way possible in the very fibre of what it does, what it says, how it acts, how it administrates, and how it teaches. It cannot be allowed to give lip service. Anything else is hypocrisy. And this brings me to the last section of this talk, how to build a decolonized architect. It is again no secret that the GSA probably not have been possible if it had not been for the 2 protest movements of 2015 and 2016, Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. Those student protests, one against a statue of the imperialist Cecil Rhodes outside the University of Cape Town, and the other against the high cost of university education, which effectively continues the exclusion of Black students that was begun under apartheid, can be seen in so many ways as the precursor to the events of this year. That context, the protests, the anger, the frustration, and crucially the hope that something could and should emerge out of it, was both the catalyst and the opening for a different type of school to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lesley Lokko'yu. Now we move on with question and answer sessions. We have a very limited time, so for Q&As, please keep your questions and comments short and clear. So now we prefer to listen to your questions from you. So instead of writing through chat box, you can just raise your hand, and you can find a button on the bottom of your screens that says reactions. So that's where you're gonna find the raise hand button. And after that, I will unmute you and you can just direct your questions to the professor. Just a quick reminder for you to activate your interpretation button so that you can hear the translator. Okay, we can give people a minute to get over their shyness.
Yeah.
Maybe Mr. Sinan can jump in. You know that this was going to happen, so I'm unmuting you.
Okay. Right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation, Lesley. It was impressive again, like last time. Thank you. It's as I like the first time, I'm very touched by it because despite the fact you are talking about issues from very far from where we live, but in a way they're so much the same. We are dealing with discrimination, and we're dealing with a lot of differences in our country as well, and culture splits and everything, with different kind of identities, which people are born into actually, and then they struggle, and there's a big polarization, like the rest of the world, I guess, these days. So it's actually maybe the people you're talking about actually maybe look different, but you are talking about very deep, similar issues that we experience all the time. That's why your ideas, your presentation is so much important, so much more valid here for us as well. We have to learn so many things about it, and how to open spaces for different kind of existences actually. And then what you named safe space, that I would call the same for Aura as well, that what we would like to be creating here as well, to a safe space for different kind of views and different kind of ideas can come together and try to understand, talk to each other and understand, maybe discuss, maybe fight or whatever. Not fight, no violence, but any kind of interaction in a way, intellectual interaction is very important for us as well. So thank you very much again.
No,
I would like to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a conundrum in so many ways that over the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, when I look at good work coming out of good schools of architecture, and I say that in inverted commas, often I'm struck by the fact that students and faculty, staff, manage to produce good work in spite of the institution, not because of it. And this, to me, is a real indictment, I think is the only word I have, that given the external pressures, given the slow understanding that these issues matter, they matter deeply, they're not just political and external, they're deeply intimate and personal. And especially in the creative disciplines, they have a direct relationship to the caliber and quality of work that's being produced. If in our context, in the academy, we are not able to transform the academy into the place that will support good work, not the place that denies it, then for me, there's something deeply systemically wrong with the idea of the institution. And I mean, it's been really interesting, even when I visited Aura, 2 years ago, that there's some relationship that I still haven't quite managed to articulate clearly between the size of an institution that is trying to be transformative and the scale of what it's trying to do. where I've seen it be successful, it's where the institution is quite small and it's able, because of its scale, to tackle much bigger issues. In some senses, the bigger the institution becomes, the less likely it is that it can. And that's a strange inverse relationship.
Yeah, I agree. So we are much more flexible, I guess, because we are not, established, on a large scale anyway. But I would like to think that we can be as flexible and as open-minded as we are now in the future as well. So anyway, thanks.
If you couldn't find the raise hand button, you can just type down your name in the chat box, then I will unmute you.
I have no idea how the translation went, so I hope it came across reasonably well. There's a question from David, yeah?
David.
Hi, Lesley, lovely to see you and everybody at Aura. I am so thrilled to be part of this. It was a beautiful, beautiful talk. I have just one comment, which is having been in different contexts professionally, Mzungu or Gwailo in different parts of the world. So my experience of otherness helped me understand quite what it was that you'd accomplished at the graduate school in Johannesburg, which is astonishing to me. And I was also very moved by two particular things that stuck in my mind. One was you saying in one of the videos, tension is good for creativity, which I think is, and that living in a state of tension, I'm thinking of as we all move into a post-COVID condition globally, exactly what that might mean for us creatively as a global community. But also I was very touched by the student project, which concerned itself with knitting as a metaphor, in the sense of sewing, knitting, and weaving as woman's work, but also sewing, knitting, and weaving as master signifiers that organize the way that we might think about pedagogy. And I wondered if that might be something that it was worth spending a couple of minutes just talking about more.
Yeah, I mean, such an interesting observation. I mean, the student in particular, so the master's program at the GSA was a 2-year program, and both of those two students did spectacularly bad work in their first year. And this for me was a real lesson in what the gestation period for confidence often is. And one of the reasons they did what I would call bad work in the first year was that they were speaking in someone else's voice. So they were both attempting to do, I guess, the conventional approach, find a community that needs uplifting, talking, through the lens of kind of social responsibility, etc. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that per se, but it wasn't their authentic voices. And it took them the whole of that year and the realization that they hadn't done what they wanted to do, and the summer break, the 6 or 8 weeks or whatever it was, for it to settle in their own minds and to be able to come back into the second year with the space and time to find themselves. And I think Safe Space accelerated certain things, but it was that 1.5 years almost of getting it wrong that helped them get it right. And I think we're taught almost instinctively, I think this emotionally as well, to shy away from tension. And I noticed that in contexts where I am, where people are too afraid of the ramifications of speaking out, so they don't, the tension goes inward. And it's often taken out internally rather than externally. So I think one of for me, one of the transformative things about the GSA was being able to turn that tension from a kind of internal anger towards an external productivity. And there's been so much talk over the past, especially over the past 6 months, about the mental health aspects of lockdown, that I suspect we're going to go into a really introspective space. And it's really imperative that we find the tools to turn the introspection away from what's happened to us personally, but in terms of what happens externally. And I think that dialogue between the internal and the external was very difficult at sometimes in South Africa, but 100% necessary. And, you know, everybody's always teaching us to look for the silver linings to the clouds, etc., and to find the positives and that kind of speak. And I think this is deeper than that. I think the next couple of years, particularly in architectural education, which is so much to do with space, and this past year we've been denied so much of it, or space has transformed into a different kind of space. I think there's enormous opportunities here to really reframe and rethink how we think about our discipline.
Thank you, David. Okay, now Meral İkincioğlu is here, and I'm unmuting you for this. Okay.
Okay. Hi, Lesley. It's very nice to see you again after our International Women in Architecture Symposium at Virginia Tech in 2017.
Very nice to see you.
And it's very nice to see you at our Istanbul online conference. Thank you for being with us. Lesley, I have a question to you. I am originally from Istanbul and currently in Boston. And since 2014, I have been studying on feminist architecture history in relation to Turkish-American women architects in the United States and so on. My most recent research project is about diverse historical documentation practice at pioneering schools of architecture in the United States. Because I think that our present is constructed by our collective memory, by our historical documentation practice. In the end of my research project, I came across with a surprising findings. At MIT, at Harvard, at Princeton, at Yale Schools of Architecture, one of the top schools of architecture in the United States, their archivists wrote in their written answers to my research question that they don't have any data, they don't have any report, they don't have any research how diverse and inclusive their historical documentation practice. As I understood, or as it became clear, Western male and white architecture profiles are also dominant in historical documentation practice, even at those top schools of architecture. They are so international, they are so multicultural, and so on. I would like to ask your comments about this issue, and I would like to know your comment and suggestion how we can stimulate more diverse and inclusive historical documentation practice, in particular architecture education. Why in particular? Because I think that architecture education is the core of all other dimensions of architecture, such as architecture profession, design practice, and so on. I would like to know your comments and suggestion. Maybe what can be a new historical documentation methodologies for more diverse and inclusive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I'm going to answer it in two ways. One was just after the student protests in South Africa, I had long conversations with the Vice Chancellor at the University of Johannesburg. And the conversations would always end with him asking me for a period of time with the question, why are there not more Black African academics around? Why don't we see them? And my answer to him was always the same, which is, we are in the process of making them. We are not going to go out and find. That is our task, is to make. That's the challenge. And I think in a really similar way, the question you're asking is not where are they and where are those practices? It is, what are the spaces that we construct in which new practices can be invented, can be supported, can be encouraged, can be critiqued, so that in 2-3 generations' time, we're not asking the same questions. And for me, what was really both exhilarating and also sometimes terrifying about starting up a new venture was that you didn't have the security of the tried and tested ways of producing something. Actually, you were making much of it up as you went along. But the alternative, if you didn't do it and you didn't accept that you were going to make mistakes, was that in 10 years' time and 15, 20 years' time, you'd ask the same questions all over again. So I think that an incredible opportunity has opened up, particularly after this past year, where we are beginning to see that the effect of not sustaining, not supporting, not underpinning new ways of thinking about education will result in another generation or another generation in exactly the same situation. So, for me, the school is the place it all begins. Education absolutely is the core of this. And if educational institutions cannot be fluid, forward-thinking, innovative, creative, risk-taking instead of risk-averse, guaranteed in a generation's time we'll be no further ahead than we are now. So in some senses it's an unsatisfying answer, but at another level, it's for me the most exhilarating answer of all, to be involved in the process of making this and of making new institutions with new institutional hierarchies, with new organizational structures, with new organizational relationships that can produce a different kind of discourse on built environments. For me, one of the key things about this area of knowledge, and by the word area, I mean issues of culture, issues of identity, issues of gender, issues of sexuality, all of the things that, in a sense, were other to the construction of the canon as we know it. One of the amazing things about this is that it forces us, the material forces us to think differently. I said as a student, the conversation, 30 years ago was always that Blackness, Africa, was too inferior as a construct for architecture, that somehow it didn't have enough sophistication, it didn't have enough history, it didn't have enough seriousness to be brought to architecture. I think actually it's the other way around. Architecture as the discipline has failed it. What we're talking about is too complex for the discipline as we know it. And that's an amazing opportunity. And it's not an opportunity only for Black or only for women or only for other. This is an amazing opportunity for everyone. It's about the construction of new canon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marad.
Dilara?
Yes, someone's raising hand, but before that, we got a question from the chat box. I'm just gonna read it, if that's okay for you.
Sure.
Okay. It's so hard for me to pronounce the name. Chatitze Kalensi. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to ask that, how do we build a safe space in our own souls? And secondly, how do we build this safe space outside of us for each of our environments and as an architect?
I'm not the best person to ask a question about one's soul in a sense, but the last slide, live out of your imagination, not just your history, for me was a very, very important statement as a graduate student, that I somehow, and it was partly to do with where I studied, was encouraged to think of my imagination as the primary tool of liberation. So my imagination was free, it was mine, it was authentic, and it was limitless. So for me, understanding that my imagination was the primary and the first safe space was really key. And how do we build this outside of ourselves for each of us in our environment? I think building new schools or new institutions is one way. And let me say that it's the way that I know how to do. And I suppose that's the only way that I can speak about them. It's the only way that I have experience of. And I think at this point, after nearly 30 years of teaching, I think I can say with confidence, I know how to do this. It might not answer every question, but I do know how to do this bit of it. And that for me is my own safe space. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now when we move on to Dilara, your video is turned off, so can you please just open that as well? Dilara, can you hear us?
Oh, hi, sorry. My video doesn't work, that's why I wasn't able to open it.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the lecture. It was great. I just really like the idea of having a more personalized approach when we're designing in school projects. And I kind of wanted to relate that to how historically we've always, like the architects have always tried to come up with a science of design and try to sort of fit it into some modules or solutions, either like through computers will save us or, other narratives try to create this, I guess, methodologies that can be repeated regardless of where we are or who we are. And I think now the same thing is happening, but through this concept of giving agency. And I think that I find that really problematic because we tend to talk a lot about problem solving or empowering communities or empowering people. But I guess the tricky thing with agency is that it's not really given, but it's more like taken. So you do it for yourself, maybe in collaboration with others. And I feel like this has become it's becoming so dogmatic that it's becoming difficult, like when you talk from a more personal perspective and you talk about the struggles that you're facing, tutors tend to get reactive and they try to pitch you back into this more scientific or objective realm. And I feel like in that sense, tutors or teachers also have to be taught somehow. And I was wondering, I mean, I don't know, this isn't really a question, but I was just wondering what you think about this, like, because it almost feels like in architectural theory and culture, some things are accelerating in a very speedy way, in a very innovative way. We invent these new tools, but it almost feels like the way we do things doesn't change. So the topic becomes from, I don't know, treating healing post-war towns to it becomes like empowering communities. So, yeah, I was just wondering what you think.
The couple of things I would say to that. One is that, when I first started teaching architecture, I went straight from being a student. So I graduated in whatever it was, June, and then in September I started teaching. And I had the unbelievable good fortune to teach with the person who had taught me, but also I think one of the people in the UK who has produced more teachers of architecture than anyone else. And the great good fortune of working alongside him for 3 years, actually, learning how to teach was an enormous drawback in one sense, because as soon as I left that school, the Bartlett, and I left teaching with him, I thought that all institutions were going to be like that, and actually they were not at all. But that 3-year experience became the absolute ground zero of my own experience when I started teaching other people how to teach. And so Samaya and Stephen, whose work you saw in those, those videos, we replicated the same system, that they taught with someone who was slightly more experienced for a year and a half, and then started assuming more and more of the responsibility of teaching themselves. But we understood that actually to teach someone how to teach is almost as valuable as, as doing research. In other words, the classic distinction between research, teaching, and service at the GSA didn't exist. Actually, all of those activities were part of the same thing. And when I look at my own continent, Africa, I would say absolutely what's required is not a new generation of architects, it's a new generation of architecture teachers. And to go back to Meryl's point, it's everything begins and ends in education. And if you think about it, a high school teacher or a kindergarten teacher studies how to teach. At the university level, you literally leave the classroom as a student one day and you start teaching the next. So, there's an almost systemic lack of preparation for what this is about to become, or what you are about to become, which, given the influence that you have over the next generation and the one after that, I think is an issue. And again, to go back to your point of the ways in which architecture is often taught as if it is only a problem-solving exercise. For me, when I came to the discipline with a set of questions that were around my own identity, it was deeply offensive to me to be made to feel as if my identity was a problem to be solved. Like, that relationship had to change. And I suppose in that way, in the context of South Africa, which is politically and socially grappling with a new way of being, like, what does it mean to be South African in the 21st century? That's a big question. That space of questioning allowed a school to emerge that could think about those questions in different ways. I found in the United States, it was almost impossible to have these kinds of conversations because that space at the wider political level just wasn't there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dilara. Okay, Hussein Yanar is raising his hand, so I'm unmuting.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much for this amazing talk and very, very meaningful talk. Just in a right scale and good scale, and giving us a lot of opportunity to think here, and like open-ended lecture. Of course, I took a lot of notes here. I have to think, but what you do is you don't care about the perfectionism, actually. Like teaching, like sketching. David said that this is like a kind of pedagogical way. Maybe also pedagogical way, like if you sketch, you don't care about anything. You are in a very personal level. So I don't know what to ask to you, but this morning was very important here. It's -15 in Helsinki. I live in Helsinki. And then I took my camera, I went out because after 2 weeks, the sunshine came. And then I began to walk coastline. I planned to go many places, but because of your lecture, I came back after 2 hours. But what I saw, I live in Helsinki for 22 years. First time the ice was getting differently, all the coastal areas. And I have never seen like that. I took many photos. But what I tried to tell that we don't look to the landscape in general, we don't look to the daily life in general, we concentrate projects and then first, second, third, blah, blah, blah, blah. We give the program and students can produce very perfect things. You are really destroying architecture very beautifully, that I agree 100%. You say reframe, reorganize, rethink. And then I always also tell to students over the years, forget architecture. And you said, forgetting architecture. And what do you think about this doing in architecture in a perfect way? Is it, of course, I predict answer why we always do the perfect things and design things, not personal things. Even with the mistakes, we can do very beautifully.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't like to sketch. And one of the things that we asked the students to think about right from the beginning at the GSA was to treat everything they were doing, every word, every drawing, every sketch, every photograph, no matter what it was, to treat it very seriously. So to introduce a level of perfection, if that's the right word, in their intention. So what we tried to get them to understand was that nothing was throwaway, nothing was unused, nothing was something that could be put under the table. Everything had to be put out. But in order for it to be taken seriously, it had to be crafted really well. So, you know, there was a level of imperfection, I think, in the thinking, because we had to acknowledge that students were going to get it wrong, that they were going to go off on tangents that wouldn't lead somewhere, that they were going to make mistakes and that they were going to fail. We had to acknowledge that. But we were very, very clear that the output had to have a level of precision that in some ways would almost fool them into thinking more precisely. And I don't know how to say it more precisely than that. And we found that, you know, for example, with students who had very, very different language, literacy, and experiences, getting them to talk about their projects was often less articulate than getting them to make. And that through the making of things, whether it was the making of objects, the making of a drawing, the making of a film, whatever the output was, for a lot of the students, there was a freedom in that because the rules in making are less clear. The rules around language, how you present, the kind of words you use, the you know, architectural the architectural language are actually quite set. But getting them to think through making, through doing, was a whole different liberation. So there was something about the relationship between perfection and imperfection that I think we were always straddling that line, which is why often the work looks more polished than it actually is. But for me, this was important because if what we were asking them to do was sometimes vague and unformed and very fluid, we had to give them confidence that the work was worth pursuing. And that confidence often came out of the crafting of it. And it's dangerous too, because oftentimes things can look like there's something, that there's a level of graphic or whatever it is, sophistication, and actually what's behind it is very weak. But, you know, 9 times out of 10, I found that wasn't the case. But actually the level of sophistication in terms of the way they made was invariably backed up with a level of sophistication in terms of the way that they thought. Yeah.
Liberation, sorry.
Go.
Sorry. You said liberation. I think if you like something, forget architecture, you are in front of a teacher, and if teacher doesn't speak a lot, if you give the responsibility to the students and then they express their own life, like really struggles, pains, whatever, I am sure if you would have if you would have done this job in Helsinki or Tampere in the north, you would have done the same thing, a different way, because there are lots of different things other side of the world, but you give responsibility to the students not to show stars or the peak of the architecture, because if you show like that, students are getting scared.
Yeah. And I mean, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I have to say that, you know, this method of teaching is hard on teachers.
Yes.
You know, we had many, many teachers who came in the GSA and who went out the door the other end, and who did not enjoy the experience. And it requires of you to be many things, to teach in this way. But to me, to go back to the earlier point that, Rome is burning outside us, and Rome is burning precisely because we will not deal with these issues. So what's the alternative? To continue to pretend as if the academy does not have some stake and responsibility in figuring out how, not just to stop the burning, but to transform it in some way. I mean, that when we talk about the transformative project of society, it's that, the world outside is not outside the academy, it's inside the academy. So, this is time consuming. It demands of you as a teacher an incredible amount. But, for those for whom teaching really is a vocation, it also gives back an incredible amount. And of all the things I'm proud of, at the GSA, yes, the students, of course, but those young tutors, I mean, I take my hat off to them. Often they came in not knowing left from right. And within a year, within 2 years, they're producing the quality of work that I don't see anywhere else in the world. And that's the genius, if you like, of the institution. It's not graduating X number of architecture students.
Okay, so
thank you,
Mr. Hussein. I think our time is up, but we have another question, if it's okay for you, Lesley.
Yeah.
Okay. So Golden, now I'm unmuting you. So can you just press the unmute button? Okay.
Hello, thank you, Seda, and thank you, Lesley, for accepting this question. It's wonderful to have been advised that this talk was going on, and I did have the pleasure of speaking at Bahçeşehir a few years ago, and I spoke then about this question, my own question, having moved from practice, an educated American in the UK, but questioning kind of the idea of identity, the unfinished architectural project, and the fracturing of our field really globally in the face of privatization, the uniformity of Pinterest and so forth. But my question, I guess, is now that you're proposing to start this new venture, the African Futures Institute, and you have a chance for a new slate that you are creating, what kind of do you see as the challenges and the opportunities there? And I guess, how would you approach it as someone who is creating in a new context itself? And I know across a bit as well, which is a lovely, both cities, fantastic, and so forth. And then hello from Northern Ireland, where I'm currently located, its own place of challenges. And so I'm an other in many places as well. And it's fascinating to hear everything and see faces that I know as well. So thank you. That was it.
It's a great question. I was asked this question a couple of weeks ago, why Ghana? And yes, it's where I'm from, but for me, this is the last really significant challenge, and I think I need to explain that in a couple of different ways. I started off in the lecture saying how the term Black, the term other, decolonized, native, whatever moniker you put on it, is very context specific. And I've spent the vast majority of my adult life, my professional life, outside Ghana, which is where I'm from. I am never more Ghanaian than when I'm outside Ghana. Now, to go back home with 30 years of experience in this sphere of identity, otherness, etc., and to try and take that experience into a context that doesn't have the same parameters. To speak of being Black in Ghana is meaningless. Everyone is Black. So for me, this is the last big challenge, is how to take this pedagogy and transplant it into a situation that I think I know, but actually I probably don't know well. And what does it mean to take canon that was formed somewhere else into a context that doesn't have the same, traumatic relationship with it. African students are very, very different from South African students. In some senses, the South African context is sort of midway between Europe and the United States and the rest of Africa. So there was a kind of resonance or a relevance there that part of it will be relevant in Ghana, part of it won't. But for me now, this is the next big opportunity, is how to take this, this impetus and allow it to be changed radically by its context. So, you know, in some senses, I understand the confidence bit, I understand the content bit. That this last big challenge is context, how to make this work in this new context. And it's not going to be easy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Hope
On
to see
that
you there.
note, on that note, we can wrap up our event. So I'd like to thank Lesley Lokko for her time and the expertise she has shared with us. I think I can speak for everybody from here, so that we have lots of things to think about after this session. So maybe Mr. Sinan can add something else.
Thank you.
Can you unmute yourself, Sinan?
Okay, I did.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lesley. Again, I'm looking forward next year, and then whatever you're going to establish and create in Ghana, in Accra, and then what kind of institution, and then I would be really looking forward to do some work together, maybe.
100%. 100%.
Yeah, communication as well. So thank you very much again for coming today.
Yeah, thank you everybody. Thank you for Saturday. It was a Saturday afternoon, evening, but it's great to see you. Thank you, Aura. Great institution.
Thank you, Lesley. And we were just about to forget that we have like an open invitation for you, that next time that we can travel abroad. Yeah. Anytime.
I'm coming back for the raki and fish. No, I'm coming back for Aura. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, everyone who joined.